And here it is, the very last lecture of APUSH, lecture 31, the Libs versus the Cons. This has been the long-running political divide of the 20th, 21st centuries as the New Deal liberalism gave way to conservatism. Then moderate Democrats adjusted to try to reclaim a little bit of the center. Conservatives responded back. The economy crashed, and that brought a new liberalism back. So we seem to have kind of flip-flopped back and forth between these liberal and conservative regimes. Scholars in the last few years have said increasingly that American politics is polarized. Maybe that's to do with social media. Maybe that's to do with just long-standing philosophical differences that have not yet been dealt with. In American foreign policy, there are essentially, well, two big stories. I suppose it really is one big story. One of those stories is our continuing involvement in the world's affairs, the U.S. as the peacekeeper, as the preeminent nation of the world. For example, when under President Bush, the U.S. freed Kuwait from the clutches of Iraq, and that had nothing at all to do with how much oil Kuwait produces or how much money the Bush family makes in oil, so I don't even know why I would bring that up. But another example of U.S. intervention around the world is where we're stepping in to take care of, like, a smaller nation on being bullied, would also be the Bosnian war, the genocidal war that happened in Bosnia-Herzegovina, for which President Clinton brings U.S. involvement in to stem that. But those conflicts are really kind of illustrations of, the kinds of trends that have always been there since the end of World War II. The bigger story is the war on terror. At the end of the Cold War, the U.S. really had no major problems with the rest of the world in 1991, other than our continuing involvement in Middle Eastern politics or other places around the globe. Those things would change with September 11th, 2001. 9/11 launched a new phase of America's engagement with the world. This global war on terror. So it's not a war on a place, not a war on a particular locale or regime. It is on the idea of terror itself, wherever that may be. And significantly, this led to the creation of a brand new cabinet agency, the Department of Homeland Security, to coordinate defense from across the United States, all the intelligence into keeping America safe at home. It spurred the creation of the Patriot Act and the debate and then subsequent court cases over that. What are the limits of freedom in fighting a global war on terror? How do you define a terrorist, and how can we use that definition in ways that might undermine American freedom? What are the tools available to American agencies to track down this global network of terrorists? And are those tools, in some ways violations of our cherished rights in the Bill of Rights? So plenty of debate over that and how to fight a global war. And then the war went specific in an actual place, and the place was Afghanistan, which harbored the mastermind behind 9/11 and led the United States in search of finding this mastermind, Osama bin Laden. The war took a different turn, though, in 2003 with Iraq. Iraq had been involved with the United States before. There was the Iran-Iraq War. And of course, there's the freeing of Kuwait from Iraq under Bush the First. But the Iraq War of 2003 is a decidedly different conflict, because this is the first time that the United States will go into a nation that it says is a threat, but hasn't actively attacked the US directly. This leads to a whole host of changes known collectively as the Bush Doctrine. The pretext for invasion is weapons of mass destruction, of which there is no evidence there were any. In fact, we have good evidence now that this was a dishonest pretext, solely for the purpose of invading Iraq. And because this was a threat, but it was a threat that hadn't done anything, the United States felt collectively that it would be okay to stop a threat rather than wait to be attacked. Remember, this is post 9/11 thinking. You don't want to wait until someone is able to inflict damage on you. So the US preemptively invaded. Now you could argue earlier attacks on other places were pretty close to this line of preemption. The Mexican War is pretty sus in terms of the US motives and right justification to enter that war. So preemptive invasion of Iraq. Now that could have been just an invasion, find the so-called weapons of mass destruction and leave them and be done with it. But there was another part to this Bush Doctrine. And Bush, in fact, was really hearkening back, I think, in a lot of ways, to Woodrow Wilson with this. Regime change became another aspect of the Bush Doctrine. The US would spread democracy to Iraq. That is, it would completely change the country's system of governance, and it would make it a nation more favorable to what Americans like and want to deal with in the world. So in effect, we would eliminate the system that they lived under and create one that was very much like our own. And that's a pretty big change, though I think you could see in ways it not only echoes anti-communism efforts and things that we'd already done in the 20th century, but also Woodrow Wilson's claim to be making the world safe for democracy. This Bush Doctrine was also linked to the use of torture to gain intelligence information. Since we're not invading a country necessarily, except for Afghanistan and Iraq, you capture terrorist suspects, and then you have to find out where they are located, what are their movements, where are their assets. And a lot of the work in doing that was through torture. Two psychologists mastermind this torture program. They have since been thoroughly discredited by the American Psychological Association, since the APA does not regard the use of torture as ethically permissible for psychologists. Torture also discredited the US on the world stage by making Americans look barbaric and in violation of the rules of war by torturing people. Under George Bush, the first Bush, Bush 1, the US invaded to protect Kuwait from menacing Iraq. This t-shirt at the time called out Bush for the Bush family's ties to the oil industry and noted that maybe really it wasn't about just taking care of poor little old Kuwait. The t-shirt took Bush's own words and then strategically replaced them to let readers really know what was going on in the Gulf War invasion. This is clever. 9/11 is a pretty big game changer for the United States. It's the largest attack on American soil. the devastating destruction of the Twin Towers, the Pentagon attack, the plane that landed in the field in Pennsylvania, all of that collectively shocked the American psyche, really shocked Americans into realizing that we're not safe in our own borders, that the Atlantic moat and the Pacific moat are no guarantee of protection. And so it's hard to underestimate how much of a game changer that is, and just Americans wanting their defense and foreign policies to protect them from a world that can strike within American borders. Ask anybody who is alive and remembers, don't ask dead people, because I just realized that made no sense. Ask anybody who remembers being alive and awake and conscious and doing things when 9/11 happened, what they were doing, where they were when all of this occurred. And the memories are pretty strong, albeit some of them probably a little bit modified by subsequent experience. Once again, satirical note on U.S. involvement in the Middle East, all boiling down to oil. And torture, as well as mistreatment of prisoners at the Abu Ghraib prison, damaged the U.S.'s credibility on the world stage throughout this conflict. Another big story is the globalization of the American economy in this time period. Globalization becomes the hot topic to talk about in the 90s. Part of that is tied to the fact that Americans increasingly realize just how connected they are to the world. And those connections had long existed, trade had long existed, but the fact that Americans are buying products made not here, but in Cambodia or other places in the world, Americans' jobs being shipped overseas, companies operating in the US and in other places around the world, that sort of comes home to a lot of American thinkers in the 90s. But what makes it really, really powerful in the modes of many thinkers, minds of many thinkers, is internet technology. The invention and the spread of the internet allows people to communicate across vast distance in real time and to accelerate all kinds of trade and communication of data, large amounts of data. Whereas before, you might need to do that via phone lines and fax and other ways that were slower and decidedly less efficient. Companies operating in multiple nations are known as multinationals, so chances are good that you will find something made in America, but maybe parts of it were made somewhere else by another branch of that company in another country. That frequently happens with a lot of products that are sourced in different locations around the world, maybe put together here in the United States. The borders of many places are more open to migration because of, loosening of migration restrictions. 1965, the act that reforms the quota system in the United States is a good example of that. But that's also going to lead to worries about border security, especially in the wake of 9/11. Who's getting into our borders? How are they getting in? Are they safe? Are they good? Are they going to be a threat? A sign of this new global economy is Nafta, 1993. This is a signature move of the Clinton presidency, but modified under more recent President Trump. This was a free trade treaty between the United States, Canada, and Mexico to increase the flow of trade across those borders, to decrease tariffs and other barriers that would make it harder for Americans to be involved in this increasingly global economy. Critics at the time worried about the loss of jobs in an era when wages were already declining. They also pointed out that many of these countries had systemic, like legal, political, and environmental problems that allowed companies to exploit the labor of the people in other nations. You know, for example, the masks produced for us here at the school are made in Cambodia by women who earn about $190 a year, because the Cambodian garment industry, about 800,000 women, mostly women, they have a minimum wage there, and it's about 190, 192, I think, currently. Even though labor organizers recognize that probably it should be around 588, then those masks come here to a local company in Westerville. And so that leads people to debate and talk about, you know, is this being ethically produced? Under what conditions? Do the companies in those places produce pollution that damages Cambodia? What are these, all of these issues that suddenly are much more complicated to talk about because we have them in other nations? The interconnectedness of the global economy was illustrated pretty strongly by the 2008 meltdown. An unregulated housing market burst, and as it burst, it led to a major recession in the US, and then everybody else that is tied to the US will be pulled down in this recession, since there will be a decline in trade globally overall. The United States at the time saw the election of its first African-American president, Barack Obama, a Constitution law scholar, an Illinois senator, who used stimulus funds, sort of hearkening back to, say, the New Deal, to ease the pain of this global meltdown as we waited for the economy to recover, for the connections across the globe to recover. More recently, I could add to this and say the coronavirus, you know, has also created a global shutdown. For example, 1/3 of factories in Cambodia shut down in 2020 as a result of declining orders for garments. And so our current pandemic has affected global economies as well. And we are living through a particularly great illustration of that interconnectedness thanks to technology and Zoom, life on Zoom. What would this year have been without it? These folks clearly don't like NAFTA. After NAFTA, Americans get the shafta. So don't export those jobs to America. Sad to say, but already the jobs were being exported. My favorite example of that is RCA, a company that made radios and then televisions, starting in New Jersey, moving to the Midwest when labor values went too high, then moved to the South, employed African Americans. When African Americans unionized and pushed value of labor up, RCA picked up and moved to Mexico, long before NAFTA. The third major story in this time period is the liberal-conservative divide. And that divide would sort of flip-flop back and forth as Americans debate whether or not it's a good idea to continue to expand the welfare state, or should it be brought back down to a more manageable, cost-effective size. Conservatives really hammered the welfare state, particularly up till recently, as wasteful spending, as giving a benefit to people who don't really deserve it. And there have been a lot of ways that they've tried to fight back against it. It is expensive. It eats up a big portion of the U.S.'s government budget. But those social programs are very popular, and these programs, like, for example, Social Security from the New Deal, are deeply embedded in America's political and economic experience. So it's hard to take that away without people feeling like they've been cheated, it's been stolen from them. Liberals reined it in a bit. And President Clinton is a really good example of this, of moderating and being more like middle center Democrat. He's a Southern Democrat, so obviously comes from a different context for Democrats to begin with. And he will famously adopt some of these conservative ideas and kind of work with them, particularly because Republicans are hounding him in 1994 with their contract with America as they push back against liberal policies. And Clinton is only able to do some things. He can't challenge, gays and lesbians serving opening in the military. He can't open really the debate on healthcare in America. So he's kind of hemmed in a little bit because of the power of these conservative criticisms, which he takes some and works with them. A great example of working within that sort of conservative pushback is the end of welfare as we know it. And Americans, I don't think, feel fine necessarily after that. If you know the song reference I just made, I think you'll figure it out. That was in 1996, where benefits would be limited to 5 years. You must work for benefits. So this is also known as workfare, which Clinton will sign into law. Another example of the liberal push forward, but then kind of limited to a certain degree, would be the Affordable Care Act, popularly known as Obamacare, which sometimes confuses people who think Obamacare and Affordable Care Act are two different things. This was a 2010 measure to mandate health insurance as a way of lowering costs. By forcing everybody to get in the system, it would therefore lower healthcare costs. But it has been repeatedly challenged in lots of ways by conservatives. Every single year, they've tried to chip away at this liberal program. The debate between conservatives and liberals over social policies continues unabated as there's disagreement over abortion and the rights of reproduction for women, numerous laws dealing with abortion and health care for women, the issue of whether or not we should be teaching evolution in schools. Should schools be completely secular? Should they be open to other ideas? We've also had fights over curriculum having to do with how we teach African American history, how we approach the story of women in America, and of course, that darn gay agenda that never seems to go away, which a lot of conservatives have rejected and has shown up in lots of ways, such as, gay wedding cakes, gay florist shops, and other fights. But has also gone to places such as the Supreme Court in the famous Obergefell v. Hodges case, which generates the marriage equality ruling. These debates will not go away anytime soon, but we have continued to see them shift and grow over time as Americans continue to figure out what exactly is the place of these marginalized and minority groups in society. How will the law protect them? In what ways will we use the law to give them more freedoms and more rights to positively impact their lives? Here is the leader of Contract with America, Newt Gingrich, who ran into trouble with his own ethics problems and scandals. Look him up. He's a very fascinating guy, but absolutely morally repugnant in lots of ways. Especially look at how he treats his exes. Clinton, signing workfare, a new beginning, welfare to work. He's smiling, she's smiling. These two ladies, I'm not so sure. I wonder if they felt like they were props on stage at this particular event, because Much of the welfare and workfare debate has centered around how African Americans are viewed and how they are treated in terms of the welfare system. And Obamacare, the signature policy of the Obama era, besides some of the other things that he's noted for. But this is the one that'll probably be the most long-lasting because it's such a big shift in how Americans view healthcare. Not new. Progressives had talked about healthcare. Truman had tried it as well, and Obama did it. And for the future, considerable debate will rage over the Second Amendment, abortion, gays and lesbians, whom this group of people thinks are going to hell, along with a lot of other people too. They have a lot of hate for folks. The Westboro Baptist folks, you may recognize them. They're nationally known for their inflammatory and hateful language. In our own time, we have seen debates over Black Lives Matter, the return of white supremacy, the Proud Boys. These cultural fights that spread into politics and the law are still going to be with us for the foreseeable future. And that, my scholars, is not the end of American history, it's just the end of the APUSH lectures. It's been a fun journey. Take care.